Hey everyone, welcome to the Gillenorian History Show. My name is Jimmy, and I will be telling you about the Wise Old Man. You've probably already heard of the Wise Old Man. He's quite a celebrity around here, if that's what you want to call him. I met this guy a while back. His story was full of surprises. Let me take you on a trip back to that night. It was pouring rain that night. I was on one of my routine walks. I take those sometimes. Don't ask too many questions. But this time, I'd walked a bit further than usual. I'd gotten a quest from an old man in Drainer Village. "Bring me some red onions," he said, "and I will give you a reward." I was eager to do any quest I came across on my adventure, and this one seemed easy enough. A red onion? What kind of quest is this? An hour passed, and I was still searching. Perhaps the man had sent me on a fool's errand. He's trying to play me. But I continued the search. Drainer Village is a dump. I left the stone road behind and followed a dirt path to the small village of Lumbridge. Surely one of the farmers will have a red onion. It was still raining, and after a while, the road was a little too slippery to keep walking. Luckily, I took some agility lessons last week, and I was able to jump over the puddles with ease. I am talented. It began to rain even harder, and I looked around for a shelter. I heard some man laughing and tankards being clashed together, with shouts and cheers. A pub. My second home. I never knew that the small village of Lumbridge had a pub. As I approached, I heard a man shouting. His voice sounded familiar. When I walked into the bar, I saw the old man, and he was drunk. Drunk as a dwarf. "Hello, my boy," he mumbled to me. "Welcome to the Shared Ram." The Wise Old Man. You would not call him that at all if you saw him in the state that he was. One moment he was laughing and talking to the wall, and seconds later he was crying under the table saying, "I'm forgotten, my mom hates me." He was alone, and I thought he needed some company, so I walked towards him and I asked about his past. He stopped crying and began to sit on his chair again. He seemed to be very pleased that I had asked this question and immediately began telling me his story. The man was called Dionysius. Dionysius. I can't remember how to pronounce it, to be honest with you. He was very drunk when he told me. He was born and raised in Varrock. At that time, Varrock had a school to which he went to every day. He loved that school and was distraught when they tore it down to make room for a giant marketplace called the Grand Exchange. A few years after the Grand Exchange was built, he and a few others formed a brotherhood called the Iron Men, and they protested against the Grand Exchange. These Iron Men vowed to never use that marketplace or trade with people who went there. Most of the normal folk hated these Iron Men, as some of these men were boastful and entitled, and they assumed the world of Gillenor revolved around them. Dionysius, you know what, we're gonna call him Dion from now on, that's a better name for him. He became bitter for a few seconds and told me he never received any recognition from the Brotherhood before they kicked him out. When I asked why he was thrown out, he told me that his love for magic made the Brotherhood distrust him. The leader of the Iron Men owned a beautiful gold helmet. Dion tried to transform this helmet into a diamond helmet to impress the leader. This failed horribly, and the helm disintegrated. "How could I have known that the helmet was a family heirloom?" he said. The leader was furious and banned Dion from ever joining the Brotherhood again. After the incident with the Iron Man, the Wise Old Man went to live with the dwarves. "At least these dwarves treated me with respect," he told me. He had gotten rid of the ice trolls that blocked the way for the dwarves that lived in a small village called Keldagrim. When the ice trolls left, the dwarves expanded the caves, and Keldagrim soon became a large underground city. The dwarves wanted to reward him for his service and gave Dion his cave to experiment in. They also built a railroad from Keldagrim to his cave so they could send him all the supplies he needed. Dion finally felt like he was appreciated, and with his newfound courage, he undertook a big project. When I asked what the project was, he didn't want to tell me. He did tell me what happened at the end of his project. For the wise old man, it was a huge success. But the dwarves didn't agree with him. They had felt tremors throughout the city of Keldegrim while he was working on his project. And after repeatedly asking him to stop, they demanded that he left. Dion knew that he couldn't work on the project without the help of Keldegrim, so he left his whole project in that cave and went to Ardoin. After leaving his project behind, he became depressed. He spent years in the Ardoin sewers, experimenting on rats and eating cakes that he stole from Ardoin stalls. He lost his morals, his ways. Eventually, he turned to necromancy, and in a drunken rage, he successfully raised some pirates from the dead in the northern part of the wilderness. After he sobered up, he went back there but found that the undead pirates had disappeared. He'd forgotten what they looked like, as he was too drunk, so he couldn't even recognize them, even if he went searching for them. Then Dion stopped talking for a few seconds. He stared at his beer glass and said with a sad, raspy voice, "I hope those pirates haven't bothered anyone. They'd be unstoppable in their current form." I sat there and thought about the stories from sailors who told of a captain with no skin. A deadly crew of fiends who'd take no prisoners. I didn't tell him that, as that would probably push him off the edge, knowing that he was the cause of many, many dead sailors. Instead, I took another sip from my glass and asked how he left the Ardoin sewers. Dion looked up and continued his story. After 3 years in the sewers, he was finally found by a wandering adventurer that was supposed to collect a very expensive teacup that fell into the drain. The adventurer sat down with him and they talked for hours. This adventurer had great interest in the history of Gielinor and actually wanted to become a historian one day. The wise but not quite yet so old man was around 45 at the time. He liked this adventurer and shared some of his tricks he had learned when he went to school. He gave the adventurer a crystal ball with special properties for helping him out in his depressive state. When the adventurer had gone, Dion gathered all of his belongings and left the sewers behind. From then on, he lived as nomad, moving around from place to place, sleeping in a tent. He didn't know what he was looking for, but the only way for him to stay sane was to keep moving, so he did. One day, a kind couple invited him to stay with them for a few days. The only condition was that he told their kid some stories about his travels. Entertain him for a while. Apparently, the kid was a fan of his, and the kid's parents wanted to surprise him for his birthday. Dion liked that kid, although he had a strange obsession with Mauritania. His whole room was filled with maps and drawings of snail helms. It was very psychotic. The kid wanted to make history as an adventurer that never left Mauritania. The old man tried to talk the kid out of it, as that's ridiculous, and nothing successful would ever come of that. Mauritania is a dangerous place after all, and such a goal was just clearly unreachable. Yet no one could persuade the boy against his obsession. He would not settle for anything less. Get it? Yeah, you get it. After a few days, he went on his way again. This time, he went to the desert to study a famous ancient pyramid. The pyramid had 4 huge towers with crystals inside them. The crystals were missing, however. There was no entrance in sight. With some kind of magic, the wise old man found a way in. He found an altar with some ancient markers on it that gave off some dark magical power. Suddenly, he felt like he couldn't breathe. It was like something was holding his throat, but there was nothing there. Suddenly, all the walls began to light up with purple text, and he heard a screech. He fell on the floor and crawled towards a chair that was in the middle of the room. He pulled himself up and sat on the chair. Suddenly, the room disappeared, and it felt like he was falling. After what felt for a few seconds, he opened his eyes and saw something that scared him to death. He used one of the most powerful spells that he called the Saradamian Drain. This took away the target's magical energy, which would leave the target powerless. But something went wrong. It felt like he had drained himself. He tried to break the spell, but he was unable to move. Then he heard something speak. "Sir Darman, there is no light here, only emptiness. So these mortals needed someone to worship, and they choose you. It seems like Guthic's plan for Gielinor didn't work after all. Let's find the fool. He fell out of the chair and could finally breathe again. And he tried to teleport to Ardoin, but the runes didn't seem to work. Unable to use any teleport magic, he spent hours walking to reach the nearest human camp and fell asleep. A few days later, he woke up and felt like a weight was lifted off his shoulders, but there was still a dark presence in him. He always had a strong connection to his god, Saradam, and when he was a young boy, he spent many hours reading about the god and felt his presence. Since then, his magical power grew at a fast rate, but that magical power felt different now. He always knew his magic had different sides. There was a dark and a light side, both fueled by emotion. Most Zamorakian mages only use the dark, and most Saradaminists only use the light. But he felt something different. It felt like there was another side, something ancient and without emotion. After weeks of practicing, he could not use any of the new magic that he felt was in him. It felt like the magical power was waiting for something. He decided to ignore it for the time being. It had been years since he had defeated any monsters. The feeling of all these hopeless people made him sick to his stomach. So he went on his way to find a quest. After a few weeks while visiting the gnome stronghold, he heard of a terrifying sea monster group that were plaguing the Piscatorius fishing colony. It seemed like one of his old buddies called Herman was working there, and he thought it was the right time to show himself to the world again. And so he ventured to the Piscatorius fishing colony and fought with the sea monsters. They were fierce creatures from the depths of the sea. He drove them back into the sea and saw a giant kraken-like monster watching from afar. He thought the kraken would attack him, but it just swam away. All the workers of the colony thanked him and gave him many gifts. He was glad to have helped these poor people and decided to attack the Calphite queen that was plaguing the desert. After only 2 hits, the queen was dead. Dion felt bored and tried to attack even stronger opponents. He traveled to the tropical island of Karumja to search for opponents to defeat. He quite liked the tribes that he found there and began to live among them. Forgetting all about his mighty quest, he spent hours walking through the jungle and sleeping along the shores, listening to the waves. After a few years, a man came to visit. His name was John, and Dion remembered him from his time in the sewers of Ardoin. The young historian had become a man and was still carrying the crystal ball that he had given him. They exchanged some stories, and he regained his adventurous spirit and traveled with him to hidden caves all over Karumja. Here they found a dungeon with all types of evil beasts. Dion then told the tribe people that they should ask adventurers to pay a small sum when they wanted to enter the dungeon. The tribe's people thanked him and gave him many gifts. He got used to that. John didn't want any gifts. The only thing he wanted was a stronger crystal ball to gaze into the timeline. Dion then enchanted the crystal ball, and they both left Karumja. John went on a new expedition to Mauritania, and Dion went to Varrock to live with his friend. A few years passed, and he heard about the success of the Brimhaven dungeon toll. Apparently the tribesmen had become very rich from the toll, but had not credited him at all. He then left Varrock and went to... The wise old man had fallen asleep. I tried to wake him, but it was no use. Some of the other people in the bar helped me carry him into a bed. I knew that the only reason that he had told me all of this was because he was drunk, and so I left the bar. The next morning, I went to Draenor Village to ask the villagers about the wise old man. One of the villagers told me that he had robbed the bank. This didn't sound like the man from the stories. I asked if she had any evidence to support this claim, and she told me that he had bought all kinds of new furniture just a week after the bank was robbed. The other villagers told me that this was true. I decided to check his house after dark. Maybe he had some evidence in his house. That night, I found a crystal ball which contained the events of the bank robbery. The ball clearly showed the wise old man destroying the bank's wall, killing people, and taking money. What could have led this man to such heinous acts? This was not at all the man that I had come to know from the stories. Over the next few weeks, I did some research and I found a man called Herman. He was an old friend of Dion's and had written a book about him. I asked if I could borrow the book for a day, and in that book, I read some interesting stories. When Dion was 15, he and a few friends graffitied on the southern Zamorakian temple. This happened sometimes because the Zamorakian and Saradomin youth were always at odds against each other, sometimes throwing camel dung against the temples or burning holy trees. But you wouldn't expect it from the hero of the people. The book ended with, by now an adult, Dion returned to the civilized lands and finally traveled to Intrana. Always a tough youth, he had now learnt great magical powers, and many on Intrana recalled that they were in awe of his abilities, venturing fearlessly into the cave, under that... Something must have happened in that cave. I asked Herman, but he didn't want to disclose that information. This is what I've learned about the wise old man. Some of the tales that he told me might not be entirely true as he was drunk, but I think most of it was. I'm not too concerned about him, though. What's in the past is in the past. I mean, he was there for me when I was fighting that dragon girl from Dragon Slayer 2. You know, he contributed. That's all that matters, is that he's making an effort nowadays. But I hope you learned something new about this guy, who was once my hero. Thank you for watching this episode of the Gillenorian History Show. If you like this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content just like this. Have a great day.